Welcome back, folks. What I look at in this video is some kinetics of carrier proteins, and I want to show you that the kinetics you see in carrier proteins are somewhat analogous to the kinetics we saw for enzymes. So let's take a look at this graph here of two carrier proteins, the GLUT1 transporter for glucose in erythrocytes and the GLUT2 transporter for glucose in the liver cells. So we'll come back to the graph in a moment. Let's have some general comments to start with, though. So what you see from the graph, given there's Vmax, half Vmax, and curves and substrate concentrations and that kind of thing, you can see that we can look at dynamics of carrier proteins much like we look at the kinetics of enzymes. So here, facilitated diffusion using a transport protein or a carrier, involves the binding of a specific substrate, being a solute, on a solute binding site of the carrier. That's like a substrate for an enzyme binding in the active site of the enzyme. And then the carrier and the solute form an intermediate structure. Then there's a conformational change, and then the solute is the solute is then transported across the membrane based on the conformational change. And so the carrier proteins tend to be regulated by external factors, and we're not going to get into the regulation of transport right now. That'll probably come up sometime later. Like enzymes, carrier proteins are highly specific for their solutes, and so we talked about how some enzymes have very specific binding sites for their substrates. Carriers have very specific binding sites for their solutes. So GLUT1, for example, in erythrocytes, that will only move a few types of monosaccharides, and it's even then specific for the D isomers, and so alone. So it's said to be stereospecific. It only moves certain isomers of certain sugars, so very, very specific. Now, like enzymes, carrier proteins can also be saturated. So remember, as what we talked about, is that in this initial linear stage of the reaction, we won't look at the GLUT2 curve here, the initial linear stage of the reaction for an enzyme is directly proportional to increasing substrate concentration. In an enzyme, in a carrier protein, this initial rate of carriage of the solute is again directly proportional to the substrate concentration. Here it's the external concentration of glucose, because that's the solute being moved. But then as we get up to a certain point, as we get up beyond Vmax, the rate of carriage, the velocity of the movement of the solute starts to plateau. And so that's because carrier proteins can become saturated as the solute concentration reaches a certain point. That's because the number of carrier proteins is limited, the number of solutes they can move is limited, and so you reach this finite maximum velocity for moving solutes. So much like enzyme kinetics, carrier facilitated diffusion exhibits this phenomena of saturation kinetics. And so we can, just like we did with enzyme reactions, we can talk about the Vmax, that's the maximal rate of solute movement for the carrier. We can talk about half Vmax, that's the substrate concentration at which we get half the maximal solute transport rate, and we can even work out the velocity as a function of Vmax times the substrate concentration divided by Km plus the substrate concentration. So we can work out specific velocities once we know Vmax and half Vmax. So that's just a little bit of an introduction to the kinetics of carrier facilitated diffusion, what you guys will have heard of as facilitated diffusion. That's it, and I will be back next time. I'll see you soon.